Short introduction, I'm a team lead at Solvion. Here are all my social connections to reach me. That's the important part on that screen. To give you some reference or to make some context clear, what I want to talk about to you today is Teams development, and you are probably all familiar with that kind of graphic or screen. What we want to do today is that we want to create a tab using web technologies, calling Microsoft Graph with Visual Studio. So ticking a few of the boxes of this Microsoft slide, what we're going to use to do that, something that I talked about like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we will use TeamsFX as a library. Here we are. And of course, we will write .NET code. Again, let me make a short joke on costs of our React friends. I promise there won't be any promise in my code because it's .NET. Just for reference, what is the TeamsFX? On this slide, like the toolkit, and this is a library that is provided by the Microsoft Dev and Teams team to allow you to reuse their investments in terms of the library so that you can easily integrate your applications or start from scratch. And basically, you have a nice library that helps you with things like authentication and a couple of setting in Teams. And that is exactly what we're going to look at right now. So from here now, let's move actually into the demo. At first, I will start the application first, so we will have a short idea what we're going to look at. And I'm opening up it over here in this window. Very simplistic UI at the beginning. I select one of my teams that I joined. A nice spinner waits for a couple of seconds and comes back with some data from a couple of graph endpoints. The idea of this application is basically really something that I created for myself a couple of months ago, because when you develop for Microsoft Teams and you're doing proof of concepts, you always need those IDs of certain teams, of your channels, of your team. And of course, you can go to a great tool of Graph Explorer. You can go to Postman and reuse all those tools to always get those ideas. I like to have my own UI at first because, first of all, I learned TeamsFX a little bit that way. And second of all, I just want to have like, these are my joint teams in that tenant. I click that, what I need to work on right now. And then after a couple of seconds, it shows me all the properties of the team, like, all that's coming back from the Teams object from the graph call, all my installed apps in that team. So it's not only the things that I deployed there or you as a developer deployed there, but also, of course, the built-in applications that are available in Teams. And in Teams, everything is application. Breakout rooms is application. The calendar is application. Calling is application. And that became handy already a little bit if you need to adjust policies and you need those IDs. And it's just another way to retrieve this information directly in Teams without the need to go to Postman or to Graph Explorer, because remember, Teams is all about reducing context switches. So we have here channels, of course, so we can have a look into what is the graph giving us, what is the API giving us in terms of channels, and how are they represented in the API with all their IDs. And there should be a reference over here. Still, those things should mean something to people that used to work with Skype. Same nomination like back in the days. Of course, also the members are there, so you can have a look at also what are the team members in your specific team. That's important, or that's something that helps if you create a bot that should mention someone or that should notify someone, then you need a couple of those IDs. And that's basically the idea of this little help application that I created for myself. And then it was like time, okay, let's make that a proper sample so that the whole community can have it and play with it. And that was the idea somehow, I think, in November last year. And I'm still not done. We will see that it's a lot more than it was back in November. But what's missing still, that to be a sample in the PnP repo, in the community sample, is I need to create the documentation and the README, because Of course, I added a couple of features and I did a couple of things that make it more complex to deploy, and I need to really describe that so that you can also deploy that to your local tenant. But let's have a look at the application itself, or how we can achieve that. So let's start from the Teams manifest. Of course, it's a TeamsFX solution, so I went through and created a new Teams tab based on the template. If you're not familiar with TeamsFX, there should be a YouTube video out from the last community call, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, where we introduced you to TeamsFX in general. I won't go into detail to that. So we want to spend our time really like, okay, we assume that TeamsFX is known. And with that, we assume that, okay, you're a Teams developer, you know what a Teams manifest is. And we start by looking at what is our static tab, because what we saw first was a private tab in the UI world. In the API world, it's called a static tab. It's a content URL with /tab. So let's find that page. Going to pages, tab, here we are, very simplistic, using Teams Explorer components, a nice UI representation with that card of a certain UI framework, and then my Teams Explorer. And the last time I showed you TeamsFX or Blazor, actually, that's the technology that we are using here. I just started with the sample project that comes basically out of the box with TeamsFX. This one is already modified, so there is no C# code down there. So everyone that listens or reads Uncle Bob's books of software architecture and clean architecture, we are not messing around with these things today here. So that's clean code, clean Blazor code. Why Blazor? You see a reference to certain C# elements directly in HTML. That's the beauty of Blazor, that you can use C# in the front end. But again, we have this dropdown. Remember from the demo, basically that's the only thing in there that is generating an event, because when we change something, then we show different values in our tabs here, in our items. And I created a couple of different tables to represent the data. And basically those tables are then populated with values from our variables in here. In the backend, of course, there is a C# file. You can always create a Razor component and create a code behind file by just naming a new class exactly like your Razor file, like component.razor.cs, and then add the partial keyword on top of it, because with that, Visual Studio and the .NET world basically realizes, okay, I need to mix up those files during compilation or exactly before compilation so that we can create clean code. So we have a partial class here with, again, you see here the definition of all those values from the front. And then it's pretty straightforward. In our lifecycle method on after render async, we are saying join teams, await data service get teams. So again, something that I'm introducing you to now compared to the sample from 2 weeks ago, we're calling an actual service in here. So we're not messing around with business logic or data logic in our UI code, also not in the code behind file, because this basically just reacts on render, creates the first initial list of my joined teams, the nice notification that we saw, this green bulb saying, okay, we're good. And then it reacts on the on-team select change event. And with the on-team select change event, again, a couple of service calls that grab new fresh loaded data. And down there, there's just another method that basically gets rid of all the existing information in case of we load information for a new team. So we want to see the spinner again and keep our UI responsive and nice and easy. So the magic, so to speak, of course, is behind this data service. Let's have a look at that data service, because we are using dependency injection from .NET 6. Why? Because we are a normal .NET 6 web application. That means in our program CS, we are registering services that are available within the application. And of course, the folks that created TeamsFX also registered their services in there. So TeamsFX, Microsoft Teams, that's also part of our service chain. And with dependency injection, we can make use of the services. You will see already I also added the PnP Core in there, so we can also talk to SharePoint with that service. And of course, I'm registering our own service as well in there, so it's available to our front-end code. And in the service then, we are basically using, again, dependency injection to get the service references. And then with the get teams call, at first, we're going to create a graph client. And the graph client is something that already is also taken care of in some regards by TeamsFX, because using the graph of provider and using the Teams user credential, both things that are available through TeamsFX, you can easily call a graph service client or create a graph service client. And with that, you are back to, let's say, regular .NET SDK of Microsoft Graph. And then it's easy peasy calling graph, join teams, and getting our teams back. Of course, a little bit of sorting so that we have nice alphabetically order. And down there, get team details, all those different graph calls to get the team details and basically create a property list. So brute forcing basically over the class, over the type, and getting back all the properties for different graph calls. For the teams call, for the installed apps, it's always the same idea. Get the object back from graph and iterate through it. And we can also make one more thing. We can use our configuration, of course. And you see here Teams Explorer. So I can go in here and say, I want to show SharePoint online data, and I also want to activate the fancy mode. And of course, you see down there the PnP Core config with a certificate. So we'll talk about that in a second, but normal app settings JSON, we are using Blazor server, so it's okay to have this app settings file. It's on the server, it's not in the client, it's not in the browser of your user. Just run again. Takes a couple of seconds to spin up the local debugging. I already modified the string was not true. What did I? Okay, of course you should write proper English in here. My mistake. Let's rerun again. And with that, we have a fancy mode. So we have Parker in here because I get always mocked on my design capabilities. Now I added Parker, so no one can mess again with my design, because now you would mess with Parker as well, and no one dares to do that. But if I now select a team here, you see there are two more tabs, SharePoint site properties and SharePoint web properties. Takes a couple of seconds again to load all the data. Now a little bit more, because we are also waiting on our calls coming back from the SharePoint world. So the PnP Core library, again, team, installed apps, channels, members. And if I go now here to SharePoint online site properties, that's the properties of the site collection. You see all those fancy things in there. And sometimes it's just really, you need a use case to use the authentication of the PnP Core library. That's my use case for that. And the web properties, and you go all the way through. And again, in terms of authentication, the idea is that I'm using my own application definition for calling the PnP Core library with my certificate. Why? Because, of course, for the graph part, I'm reusing what TeamsFX gives me in terms of the SSO token. But for the PnP Core library, I might want to have application permissions, because I might want to do something else in there. And then a second application comes in handy in here. With that, let's just make a short wrap up what you saw today. Teams Explorer, it's a sample tab that looks behind the curtain of a couple of Graph and SPO endpoints. We're using TeamsFX single sign-on for graph call and a certificate-based application in Azure AD for calling PnP Core. And you saw a lot of components. We talked about dependency injection, code behind, launch settings, and saw some UI settings. With that, I'm giving it back to David. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tommy. That's really, really cool stuff, and really appreciate the depth you went in there to show how it can all be put together.